You saw a dead crow on the sidewalk once. Maybe it was on a road, maybe it was in a park. You probably remember what happened next more than the bird itself. Other crows arrived. Not one or two, dozens. They circled overhead, they landed in the trees, they made a sound you don't normally hear from crows, louder, harder, sustained, and then, after a few minutes, they left. Most people who witness this assume it's some kind of mourning. The birds saw a fallen comrade, they came to grieve, they paid their respects. It's a satisfying story. It puts the crow inside a familiar emotional frame. It lets us recognize ourselves in them. That's not what's happening. The real answer is far stranger, and the people who figured it out had to convince a scientific community that didn't want to hear it. In 2015, Kaeli Swift, a graduate student at the University of Washington, designed an experiment to figure out what crows were actually doing at these gatherings. The standard assumption in animal behavior research was that crow funerals were anthropomorphic projection. Birds congregating around a dead bird looked like grief to humans, so humans called it grief. The data was thin, the interpretations were generous. Swift wanted to test something specific. She had a hypothesis that the gatherings weren't about the dead bird at all. The setup was simple and meticulous. She and her supervisor, John Marsluff, established feeding stations in residential neighborhoods. They identified individual crow groups that visited those stations regularly. Then, on a specific day, a researcher would arrive wearing a particular rubber mask. The mask was a generic, slightly unsettling human face, the same kind Marsluff had used in his earlier crow studies. The researcher would stand near the feeding area, holding a taxidermied crow. Just holding it, not moving toward the live birds, not making sounds, just present, with a dead crow in their hands, while the live crows could see them. The reaction was immediate and consistent. The crows in the area began alarm calling. They mobbed the area. They brought other crows in. The gathering had all the features of what people had been calling a funeral. Then, the masked researcher left. Here's where the experiment got interesting. Swift came back to those same feeding stations on subsequent days. The same crows. The same food. No dead crow this time. No masked person. Just normal condition. For up to 6 weeks afterward, the crows refused to approach the feeding station. The food was the same. The location was the same. Nothing had been changed, except one thing. A person wearing a specific face had once stood there next to a dead bird. It got worse. When Swift returned wearing the same mask but with no dead crow, the live crows still alarm called. They still scolded. They remembered the face. They had connected the face to the dead bird and filed both pieces of information together. The crows weren't mourning, they were investigating. Swift's conclusion, published in Animal Behavior, was that crow funerals are danger assessment gatherings. When a crow encounters a dead member of its species, it isn't expressing grief. It's collecting forensic information. What killed this crow? Was a predator nearby? Did a specific human do it? What did that human look like? Are they still in the area? Should this location be avoided in the future? The gathering is a meeting. The dead crow is the evidence. But it goes deeper than that. In a follow-up study, Swift varied the experiment. Sometimes the masked person held a dead crow. Sometimes they held a dead pigeon. Sometimes they held a dead squirrel. The crow response scaled precisely with how closely the dead animal was related to them. Dead crow drew the largest response. Dead pigeon drew a smaller response. Dead squirrel barely registered. The crows were distinguishing between species, calibrating their threat assessment based on what kind of animal had died. A dead pigeon was a low-priority piece of information. A dead crow was a critical intelligence update. Then there is the part that researchers spent years arguing about. In 2012, John Marsluff used PET imaging to scan crow brains during exposure to a dead crow. He wanted to know which neural regions were active. The expectation was that he'd see activity primarily in the hippocampus and other memory-related areas, exactly what you'd expect from an animal storing threat information. He did see that. But he also saw activity in the amygdala, the part of the brain associated with strong emotional processing, and in regions analogous to those that handle social emotional cognition in mammals. The brain wasn't just filing data. It was responding to the dead bird in a way that looked, neurologically, more involved than pure forensic interest. The data didn't prove grief. The data didn't disprove it either. It sat in a place that made everyone uncomfortable. Then there are the behaviors no one has fully explained. Field observations from multiple researchers, going back decades, have documented crows performing actions around dead conspecifics that don't fit cleanly into the danger assessment framework. Crows have been observed bringing objects, sticks, leaves, sometimes shiny items, and placing them near the body. They have been documented standing silently in the presence of a dead crow for extended periods, then leaving without alarm calling at all. They have returned to the same location days later, when the dead bird was long gone. Lawrence Killam, who studied crows for over 40 years, described observing a small group of crows gather around a dead member of their flock. The crows did not call, they did not investigate aggressively. They stood, in his words, with great solemnity, for several minutes, then dispersed quietly. No predator was present, no human was visible, no obvious cause of death was apparent. There was nothing to learn forensically and nothing to alarm call about. What were they doing? The honest answer is that researchers don't know. The danger assessment framework explains most crow funerals. It doesn't explain all of them. The neurological evidence shows emotional processing without specifying what kind. The behavioral observations include quieter, slower, harder to interpret moments that the forensic explanation doesn't account for. Now think about what this adds up to. The crow has a face recognition system that retains a specific human face for years. It has a cultural memory that passes that face down to crows that never met the original threat. It has the cognitive capacity to connect a dead conspecific to a specific human and avoid that location for weeks. Its brain activates emotional regions when it encounters a dead member of its species. And in some documented cases, its behavior in those moments doesn't match anything in the threat assessment model. The crow at a funeral is not the crow you assumed it was. It isn't grieving in the way you wanted it to grieve, but it isn't simply collecting data either. It is doing something we don't have a clean name for, yet something that sits between pure information processing and what humans would recognize as a wake. The version of the crow that you carried into the question was probably one of two things: either a bird performing a touching ritual of mourning, or a bird running a simple input-output reaction to a stimulus. Neither version turned out to be right. What the research keeps finding is something in between, something that doesn't map onto either category. The crow is too cognitively sophisticated to fit the second version, and the gatherings are too forensic, too information-driven to fit the first. This is the pattern in animal cognition research more broadly. The questions we ask are shaped by the categories we already have. We arrive expecting either machine or mirror. We rarely arrive expecting something we don't have a word for. And when we find one, the research takes longer than it should, because the field has to argue its way out of the original categories before it can describe what the data actually shows. The crow on the sidewalk that day was dead. The crows that arrived weren't there for the crow. They were there to find out what had killed it, who had been near it, and whether they needed to be afraid. Some of them may also have been doing something else. Something quieter. Something we still can't explain. The funeral wasn't a funeral, but it wasn't nothing either. That's why they came.